Well, good afternoon, and welcome to this latest in our series of webinars on labels and how they might be of assistance to high nature value farming systems. And speaking with people who are practitioners and who know the score, know where the bodies are buried, know the ins and outs of the whole thing and the pros and cons. So today I'm very happy to introduce Jimmy Woodrow to you. So Jimmy works with the Pasture-fed Livestock Association here in the UK, and they have a label called Pasture for Life. And well, I've been interested in this for quite a while, I would say, being a pasture farmer myself, and yet not being pure enough to be able to join the label myself. So that's a really interesting thing, actually, that there's a farmer-led label that's so strict and so rigorous. And anyway, so we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end. So Jimmy's going to give a talk first about PFLA and the label, and then we'll see how we get to. Okay, so I'm going to turn my camera off and over to you now, Jimmy. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwyn. And perhaps I'll give a brief intro to myself first. So I've been with the PFLA, as we call it, for 2 years now. And my background is not actually in farming. I'm sitting here in southeast London. I've actually always lived in London, but I've come to farming through food business, I suppose, where I've spent most recently 10 years, which I suppose was also my second career, working across different food businesses, most of whom have had some form of direct relationship with farmers. And that's really captured my attention, both for the reasons which I think I would summarize as farming for flavor, that lovely connection between good farming and high quality flavor. But then also, and I once upon a time studied geography, probably about 20 years ago now. And for me, there was also a big environmental aspect to the interest in farming that I was finding. And so I found my way to the PFLA, which for me really represented all the good things that I was seeing across the food system and seemed to be a solution to many of the not so good things that I was seeing. So what I'm going to do today is to give you an overview of the organization that I run. We have been around for 10 years, no, well, actually 11 years now next week. It's our birthday next week. And it was started by a group of farmers in the late 2000s. So I think 2009 was the first meeting. And these farmers were corralled by an inspiring gentleman who'd spent his career working in emerging markets, so in rural Africa and Asia. And he spotted something that they were all doing, which is only ever feeding their ruminant animals on grass and pasture, something that he was quite familiar with, having worked in these emerging economies, but really wasn't very common at all in the UK at the time. And I think the group as a whole were very aware that this way of farming, in the fact that it was very kind of low impact, low intensity, was certainly a way of farming that we should be encouraging and perhaps represented the future for the farming system as a whole. So the first slide I wanted to show you here really encapsulates what we in the PFLA feel about the system that we're promoting. At its heart, it's a very simple system. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time today telling you about the farming system that we're promoting, because I think we're all very much on the same page. But I did want to show this diagram because I think it is wonderful in its simplicity. And I'm often, I suppose, having conversations with people who assume that farming is really complicated, really technological, full of, I guess, evil actors, you might want to say. And I think probably that, they would be thinking about all the intermediaries that get involved from farm to fork. And actually, when you boil it down, while that is probably the case for a large part of the food system, it doesn't have to be the case. And I think this diagram is a wonderful summary of why it doesn't have to be the case. And that's both in the farming side of things, so the landscape management and the animal management, but it's also increasingly true in many of the networks we work within, if we're thinking about the supply chain. So supply chains can be long and complex, but they can also be short and simple. And then likewise, farming systems can be devilishly complex, but they can also be devilishly simple. So the PFLA, 10 years in, is a community of 800 members. So we are a membership organization. We are structured as a community interest company. So effectively, the organization is being run for and on behalf of its membership. And over the course of the 10 years, I think, well, certainly what's clear to me, but I think also what's very clear to everyone else, is that it's this community which is at the heart of everything that we do and everything that is special about the PFLA. So in this, hang on. In this picture, I'm going to try and build up for you visually. I'm going to try and explain really what this community means to us. And at the heart of our community are the farmers. So probably about 80% of our members are farmers. That would be the rule of thumb. Those farmers, approximately at the moment, about 135 are certified. So you've got this kind of dotted line group in the middle, and we actually now, I just saw Nat join. So Nat is a certified member of ours. And I would say the reason for being of the PFLA is to ensure that farmers have a voice, and the sorts of food systems that we're promoting are very farmer friendly. So the fact that we are 80% farmers is really critical. And I think people of all walks of life come to us because of the farmers that we have working with us, and the fact that they're very pioneering individuals and groups of individuals. But beyond the farmers, we start to add on other groups of people that have come to us for those reasons. But really, you know, we're kind of starting to build up what is quite a rich tapestry of people within the organization. So to start with, we have other people directly involved in the production of food. So particularly butchers and retailers, definitely groups of people we look to foster and get into the membership, but also chefs. And we also certify butchers and retailers, and actually we're about to certify our first restaurant. So we want to be able to certify the entire chain from the farm all the way to the end consumer. Beyond those who are actually directly involved in the production of food, we have a number of other types of people who are involved in the PFLA. So vets is an area in which we're increasingly working with, and actually, funnily enough, you'd be surprised to hear that the veterinary industry as a whole is really not very clued up on all things regenerative agriculture. So we've been doing a big piece of work recently to try and get them clued up and disseminate information to them, so that when they're going onto farms and coming across these sorts of farming practices, they kind of know what they're doing. But also for us, the membership would include people who are directly involved in conservation, so mainly through the big conservation bodies, but sometimes at a much lower level. Academics, so we work extensively with academic institutions, and I'll come on to that later, but we do actually have some of those academics who have decided to get their wallet out and become members of the organization, partly to support what we do, but also to get access to the amazing farmers that we have in our network. And then finally, we have a kind of long tail of food and farming professionals, generally people who have some sort of professional interest, who've decided to come and see what we're doing in the organization and to get involved in some way. So I think if you look at this picture as a whole, what you have is a really quite amazing melting pot of people who ultimately are all coming together to try and solve their problems jointly. And I think this is what really sets us apart from a majority of other membership organizations who have much kind of narrower focuses, whether that's a farming organization, you know, there's loads of conservation groups. And the fact that we're trying to put all of these people under one roof, and particularly, for example, get them all onto a farm to start talking to each other, I think that's really what we're about. And I think that fact has allowed us to come up with some very practitioner-oriented solutions, which have stood us in very good stead. We also have customers. This little bubble out to the bottom right, customers are very important to us, but I think I'd say it hasn't been a focus of the first 10 years, and it's going to be a much bigger focus of our next 10 years. It's vitally important that we get the public bought into what we're doing, and I'll kind of come on to a bit of that later. As I mentioned, we are structured as a community interest company, and this kind of captures all of these people. And then finally, we operate within a much wider network of organizations and businesses who we work very closely with and who sustain us, and we sustain them. And we wouldn't really be able to operate without this wider supportive structure. And it's a big focus of ours in terms of how we get the wider food system, the wider kind of policy system to support what we're doing and support what the farmers in particular are doing. So obviously one of the things we're here primarily to talk about today is the label. So for us, this would be Pasture for Life certified. So this developed for us about 5 years ago. It didn't happen from the start. At the start, it was very much community organizing membership. The certification really evolved in order to try and tackle that last bit of the puzzle, which I was just talking about. So how do we get the public really to kind of back what we're doing and actually to help us accelerate what we're doing? So the certification is designed to do that. I think it's important to say at this stage, we are a tiny niche certification within the UK context. There was a big consumer organization in the UK called Which, who did a survey a couple of years ago. And I think that we had as a certification mark about 3% public recognition. When it comes to actual sales, we're talking about fractions of a percent at the moment. But the way we've gone about developing this certification is obviously to start with the standards, and Gwyn's mentioned this briefly earlier. So this set of standards was ultimately developed by farmers with a couple of independent consultants as well. And it was, I suppose, designed to replicate what we were seeing on farm. And I think it's fair to say it is a high bar. We're often asked, is it regenerative? And I think the reality is it is highly regenerative. We don't call ourselves on the pack regenerative because we're Pasture for Life, but I think the crossover is very high, and actually I think a lot of people who are calling themselves regenerative would be a million miles away from the level of Pasture for Life. So it is a high standard. One of the really important things to say is the way that we manage this certification. So us, the organization, we set the standards, but we don't go and audit the standards on the farm. So this is all managed by primarily the organic auditors in the UK. So this would be Organic Farmers and Growers and the Soil Association. We also do joint audits with the Biodynamic Association, and we're looking at doing joint audits with even bigger certifiers like Red Tractor, which would be the kind of the primary on-farm auditing scheme in the UK, which is pretty kind of baselined. But obviously a lot of farmers have to do this because they're selling into big contracts that demand their Red Tractor audited. So we're always looking to kind of make things easier on the farmer when it comes to that side of the process. And the fact that these two are separate means that we are, for example, able to update our standards every couple of years. That arm's length nature of us being the standards, the standards owner and the auditors who are the ones going on to farm and actually doing the auditing, it kind of allows us to be more nimble, I think, than some of the bigger auditors out there. It also means that we can keep evolving the standards, and we have done that. So for example, in the last standards update, which was 2 years ago now, we outlawed glyphosate as a means of killing a crop before something was sown into it that is then eaten by animals. So I think the standards committee felt at that point that the evidence was increasingly clear that glyphosate was not something we wanted in our farm system, and so it was removed. And that's a good example of the sort of changes that we're able to make incrementally over time. Obviously, the standards that we have developed are very focused on feed, and that's really the core of the standards. So, for example, in this list, I've given you a kind of list of prohibited feeds, and that would be one way in which we look to kind of exert influence on what's happening on farm. Something that has become also increasingly clear, particularly as we work with, government bodies, is that they're always looking for a slightly wider set of principles and standards when looking at on-farm practice. So we have started to kind of dip our toe in, if that's the right word, into other aspects of farm management. We were always careful to be not too prescriptive, and by this I mean we're not looking to put a load of red lines in the way of a farmer and make their life really, really tricky. Often we're actually, what we would say, recommending things rather than requiring them. This also allows us, for example, to put an idea into the heads of farmers about something that they might like to be doing, before at some point in the future it might be something that we demand that they do to stay within the scheme. So that's just one kind of subtle way that the standards work. And then also another big area of development in the last standards review was animal welfare, and there were strong calls for our animal welfare standards to be brought up to the same level as organic. And it's also worth saying that approximately 60% of our certified farmers are also organic. So you can see that the two work nicely hand in hand. It's quite hard to know where the bigger growth opportunities lie. I think there's opportunities for lots and lots of organically certified livestock farmers to also be pasture for life. But I also think there's lots of farmers out there that find organic too much, too administrative, possibly too expensive. And the way that our standards are structured and the way that we kind of manage them means that I think in some respects we're a more palatable alternative than organic if you're running livestock. And so I think there's big growth opportunities in the non-organic side of things. When I spoke to Gwyn in the kind of preparation for this talk, we spoke about lots of the things that we're doing, and he kind of gave me some steers in terms of what you might be interested to hear. So what I've put down on this page is a kind of list of the challenges that we're currently facing and a list of the solutions as we currently see them. So I'm going to kind of check down this list. But the first one I kind of came up with, which I would say is perhaps a bit of a cautionary tale around some of the bigger environmental schemes, which would be this issue of co-option. So how do you avoid big business in some respects taking over? Often this is indirect. It's not direct control, but it's indirect control through kind of payments. Effectively, the people who end up paying all the money tend to have the most control. And what I mentioned on the previous slide, this idea that we are at arm's length from the actual details of auditing, I think that really helps. I think the fact that we're able to make regular updates also really helps. And as long as our financial structure remains separate to our ability to change the standards, I think we will be in a strong position there. As you're clearly all aware, the environmental certification space is getting increasingly crowded, particularly with the development of regenerative certifications. And again, there's a big question mark around what the term regenerative means, and the fact that big businesses are already using it to talk about their kind of sourcing standards. I mean, I suppose the way I look at all of this is we have some very strong core principles, and if we stick to them, I think we will be able to hold our own in this kind of noisier space. And I think that's something that I think the board are all very aligned on. I think, as I'm sure we're all aware, there's a big issue with certification and I guess how it relates to small scale producers. And I think one of the reasons for the PFLA to be in existence, and one of our key missions, is to try and support small scale farmers. Most of them struggle with payments every year. I think that's a good reason why lots of them aren't organically certified, even if they're operating at that level. So we have, over the whole life cycle of our certification, we've been very clear on trying to minimize the costs to small farmers. And I also think strategically that if we focus on getting it right for the small farmer, it will work for the larger farmers too. One way that we're kind of working on this, so for example, with our certification, we have what's called a triennial option. So a farmer can have one physical audit, on-farm audit in 3 years, and then on the other 2 years you have a kind of self-assessment desktop certification. This is, funnily enough, actually what's been happening for the past 2 years during COVID, when certifiers haven't been going onto farms. This has meant that we can keep the costs, much lower. So if you're organically certified as well, and Pasture for Life is a bolt-on, you're only paying an extra £110 a year. So this has really allowed us to kind of pitch this certification at small scale producers, even though we also have much larger producers involved. One of the current challenges we're facing is around supply chain integrity. At the moment, what we do is we allow a butcher or a restaurant to become certified without having a physical in-person audit. Now we've got to the size of having 130 farms certified and more butchers interested in what we're doing. We are working on a proper audit for those organizations. I think one of the tricky things with all of this, and again, I think it's fair to say that organic is a slight cautionary tale here, is that butchers in particular tend to run for the hills whenever they're shown a bit of admin or a bit of cost. And this is something I think we need to be really careful of. At the moment, it's in some ways as important for me to know where the Pasture for Life produce is going, which butchers it's going to, which customers it's going to, as it is to try and kind of run after them with a kind of all singing and all dancing audit. So the system we're trying to design is treading a very, very kind of fine line between being robust and transparent and making sure that no one's doing the wrong thing, but not flipping over onto the other side and actually realizing that butchers don't want to come anywhere near us because they're worried we're going to try and charge them, and then actually us having zero visibility of the supply chain at all. So we're trying to work through that challenge at the moment. There's an economic sustainability angle here too. How do we ensure as an organization that we're economically sustainable? At the moment, for example, we don't make any money from certification. That all goes to the certifiers, so the organic auditors. We're looking at ways to try and introduce kind of ratchet fee scales to make sure that
okay, you froze for a while. You're back.
Oh, did I? Oh, sorry.
You're back.
Yeah. So trying to introduce different ways of managing fees to ensure that we're getting enough money to keep doing what we're doing. Labeling regulation is a big area of focus for us, and we're doing lots of lobbying on that, and I'll actually come on to that later. And then finally, with all of this, there's a big element of chicken and egg. How do you get a customer to buy this product when you're also trying to get the supplier to produce the product? And I think our view on all of this is that it all comes down to the consumer. How do we get the consumer to provide that pull factor to ensure that all the supply chain and then eventually the farmer are producing to the quality that we hope the consumer starts demanding? I'm now just going to come on briefly to a bit of I guess organization structure and strategy. So as a non-profit organization, we do have a kind of core mission, which for us means transitioning livestock farmers in the UK to a set of practices that's better for the planet, for the animals, and ourselves. Within this, and I think this is a key point that I will make. Within this, we advocate these farmers raising their animals wholly from pasture, but this is really one part of the puzzle, and I think this is best explained in the kind of three broad areas of work that we engage in. So the first one is around what I would call culture. How do we develop the sort of environment in the UK in which pasture farming is the norm, both at the farm level, but also at the kind of supply chain level and at the public level? This is primarily around education. Most of this is directed at farmers, but also others. So this is the first thing, which will help us as an organization by bringing more and more people into our network. The second pillar is around certification. I think this is a key point to make in that certification is a tool to achieve our goal rather than the end in itself. So for us, certification, as I mentioned earlier, it kind of provides that means of engaging with the supply chain and the public. It gives people confidence that what they're buying is proper. There's no greenwash there, and also it allows us to engage with kind of actors in the supply chain, without which things would be tricky. And then finally, collaboration. And for us, really, this means it was that kind of final bit of the Venn diagram I showed you earlier. How do we ensure that the kind of the wider structure in the UK is supportive of this sort of farming? And I think it's fair to say up to now, it hasn't really been very supportive. Things have been very intensively focused. We're having some successes, particularly on the kind of the science side, but there's a lot more work to do to ensure that government policy and wider kind of factors all can be brought to bear to support this sort of farming. So those are our three kind of main pillars of work. This is all delivered through a fairly new aspect to the organisation, which is a network of regional groups. So we've now got about 13 set up around the country. This was work funded by our largest funder in the UK, which is Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And the goal of this was really to ensure that our work was still grounded at the farm level. I think when you're building an organisation, it's always easy to get kind of lost in the kind of organisation to organisation conversations, and you slightly lose sight of the reason for what you're doing. And these regional groups have just been a wonderful way of just getting, just kind of reminding ourselves that what we're about is peer-to-peer knowledge exchange and getting farmers onto other people's farms and getting butchers onto farms. So there's been a real flourishing of activity in the PFLA in the last 18 months since we've started this project. And then finally, what I wanted to say in terms of the overall strategy of the organization is around this word impact. And it slightly comes back to this point around what's the purpose of our organization? Is it just numbers of farms certified? And I think I'm increasingly thinking along the lines of, no, it's not, because there are lots of farms out there who might never get certified. But that doesn't mean that the PFLA can't play a big role. And so something that I'm trying to work on, and this is going to take some time, but trying to develop some other ways to demonstrate the impact that we're having. I think a good case in point is whenever I talk to a big, whether it's a supermarket, or yesterday I spoke to Compass Group, which is the largest catering company in the world, actually, although it's headquartered in the UK. I'm never saying to them, we want you to just buy Pasture for Life product. I think that's a kind of wholly unrealistic thing to say to a big organization like that. What I do say to them is that we can work with their suppliers and help them improve their practices, because I think over the last 10 years, we've really developed some pretty impressive networks and structures for kind of helping farmers move in the right direction. And I'd like to start deploying that as a means for the PFLA to have impact, rather than just focusing on as I said, the precise number of people who are actually certified. I think the certification will take care of itself if we're doing some of these other things. Just going to briefly touch on funding streams, because I imagined it might be a question that one or more of you would have. So we have a £100 membership fee. So this is to our 800 members. That brings us in the main bit of our earned income. We have a levy scheme which is designed to be taken on the sale of a carcass of a cattle or sheep carcass. That hasn't really worked the way it's been currently structured. And as I said earlier, we're trying to work out ways in which we can take a bit of income from the certification work, which at the moment we don't really take very much, if any, income from. And then I think there are definitely opportunities when it comes to donations. We have lots of supporters who aren't willing to pay a membership fee, but would be willing to pay a small amount of money, perhaps even every year, to support what we're doing. The vast bulk of where our money comes from is from grants. So at the moment, we probably take in about 5 times as much grants as we do from earned income. Much of this comes from institutions, and I mentioned our kind of primary funder a minute ago. We do sometimes manage to raise money from individuals, sometimes from within the membership, but otherwise elsewhere, who just support what we do and want to ensure that we're kind of continued, to ensure that we can continue doing the work. So I would say the funding is a constant juggle. A lot of it's project based. So it's funding to do a very specific thing. And when it comes to the core activities of the organization, it would be overhead fees that support the core activity. We are making a much bigger push on getting decent amounts of core funding in to support the kind of the basics of what we do. Because in my view, I think it's always risky if you're reliant on project income, partly because you get diverted in all these different ways, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing what you're meant to be doing. But also it means the juggling act of whether you've got money to pay for people is a kind of constant worry. So that's our kind of funding situation. Next, I'm going to kind of come on to the kind of more of the details of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And this diagram here is a way that I've begun to try and understand why it works for us. And I think this kind of circularity is very important for the PFLA. For us, it all, as I said at the beginning, it all comes back to community. That is the reason why we're here, and I think that is the reason why we're successful. But I think as you follow this this diagram round, that there ends up being a very kind of virtuous loop, I suppose, in what we do, and how one thing that we do feeds another thing that we do, and it always comes around. And so this virtuous loop I feel like ends up moving faster and faster, and obviously with the kind of the primary mission in the middle, which is transitioning farmers towards these really gold standard farming systems. So I'm just going to go through in the next slides, go through each of these areas in turn. And the first one I'm going to start with, which for me is probably the most exciting aspect of what we're doing at the moment, which is building the evidence behind these farming systems. As you're all clearly aware, the kind of negativity around ruminant animals in the press at the moment is pretty full on. It's something that obviously we deal with every day, something that I'm sure you all deal with every day. And trying to create a safe space for these, not only for these conversations, but ultimately these animals in our landscapes has felt quite challenging at times. But there is some really wonderful work going on between ourselves and many academic institutions in the UK to try and build this evidence. And we are starting to see some of the evidence actually kind of come back, and it's all been very positive. The kind of origin of all of this for us, which is definitely something I would recommend any other organization doing, is it really came from getting a group of like-minded members around a table to try and kind of come up with some ideas. And for us, this was a group of people who were interested in research, and that was and has ended up being an interesting mix of practicing academics who happen to be members, the group that I mentioned earlier, but also some farmers who had academic backgrounds, or actually just farmers who had a strong eye for detail and were just always wanting to get into that detail. And this group and the way it's evolved, and we have provided some facilitation for the group, which has really allowed it to kind of accelerate its impact, has ended up being, as far as I can tell, a really key stakeholder group within the agricultural academic world, such that we get approached all the time now to participate in research projects, and that could be Horizon, EU level projects, it could be UK based projects. And we've really become a kind of go-to organization for any academics wanting to learn more about grazing livestock and the impacts they have. And this is actually over time, and this is where it gets really exciting, is we're actually increasingly being asked to help shape the research. So rather than being brought in right at the end of the process and said, oh, can you join this? We want to talk to your farmers, which is definitely how it started out. We're now actually ourselves proactively going out to researchers and saying, hey, we think this is a gap in the literature. Can we do something about it? And the answer is most often yes. So this is very, very exciting. And this has allowed us, I suppose, this has allowed us to kind of get quite into the detail on some of the kind of big issues of the day. The biggest one, I think we're probably all aware, is carbon. You probably can't read much of what's on your page here, but this is data taken from the now infamous Poor and Nemechek meta study from 2018, I think it was, which has just caused all sorts of problems when it comes to assessing local farming systems based on global data. And I think for us, and for me definitely, and I think for the group as well, if we kind of cast our minds back to that first slide I showed about how simple grazing animal systems can be, when you look at the data being used to beat our systems with at a kind of global scale particularly, but I mean ultimately it's all the same data. It just didn't make a huge amount of sense for us that a system that should almost be zero fossil fuel input was being branded as having the highest greenhouse gas emissions of all. So we've started to work, particularly with a couple of academic bodies, so Rothamsted in the UK and also Cranfield University, to try and develop a pasture for life life cycle analysis, which would reflect the fact that people aren't using artificial fertilizer, they're not using bought-in feed. Often there's very little fuel use because you don't actually need tractors to manage animals that are out in the field. So really trying to kind of dig into this and come up with some proper primary data. I mean, it always strikes me when, whenever you hear a kind of quantitative scientist talk about, for example, the impact of transport on food emissions, as you can see on well, maybe you can't quite see, but the red aspect of the bar chart on the left is transport. But it's pretty obvious to me that transport enjoys a pretty big economy of scale. So if you're transporting nuts from one side of the world to the other by ship, it's pretty obvious your transport emission per kilo is going to be pretty tiny. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that that ship should have left port at all if you're focusing on local food. So I think there's a whole load of kind of unintended consequences that you end up seeing if you approach food systems purely through spreadsheets. And it's that sort of data that we're trying to start counteracting. And for us, a big aspect of this would just be the really basic thing of getting an academic onto a farm and helping them understand what's going on. Because I think a lot of the people behind this data here, one of them has actually now been onto a PFLA farm, but a lot of them just haven't been onto farms. They don't understand kind of basic ecological processes. And this is something we're really trying to work on. Carbon is obviously a big thing, and it's kind of somewhat straightforward to quantify. Biodiversity, on the other hand, something that's going to be close to all of your hearts, is something that's much harder to quantify. So we've really kind of grappled with how do we provide the evidence that biodiversity is flourishing on pasture for life farms. I think we came to the fairly quick realization that it's not going to be very easy to get something quantitative, although it's not impossible, but it's not going to be super easy. So what we've been doing over the past 6 to 9 months now is running biodiversity case studies, looking at pasture for life farms in some detail and looking at specific species that have started coming back. This has really helped us open doors. I think there's a big kind of long-term question mark around whether it will change perceptions at scale, but it's definitely helped us open doors and try and explain what is happening within our farming system. And this is something that we were talking even this morning about how we evolve this program of work and continue to tell the story about the flourishing of biodiversity that is happening on our pasture for life, low input farming systems. And then if we were thinking about 3 big areas of work on the evidence building side, the third one is really economic. And I think the evidence increasingly shows that if you're farming these low input farming systems, you're going to be more profitable. And we did a reasonable piece of work in 2016, which was looking at this specific issue, looking into the economics of a handful of case study pasture for life farms, again, it was this report that I've got a picture of here was a really big and important thing to open the eyes of farmers, and kind of help them understand that this isn't just a group of hobby farmers. These are commercial farms too. This is something at the moment that we're looking to take beyond a series of case studies, because if you go and take this to some farmers, they'll say, oh, but you can't do that in my soil type, you can't do that in my geography, I haven't got the right animals. And actually, if we can work on a project and manage to get at least 100 of our 130 certified farms analysed, we hope to be able to kind of counter some of those questions by developing a series of kind of subtypes within the PFLA, and ensure that we've got an answer for most of those questions. And at the moment, we're working with a group of consultants who were behind a big report in the UK called Less is More, which was designed to show that there's a kind of sweet spot between prioritising biodiversity and prioritising economics, effectively profitability. So we're hoping, if we can raise a bit more money, quite a lot more money, to have something to show towards the end of this year on economics. And then finally, and occasionally we end up being lucky enough to be part of these types of projects, but you end up with a project that, you know, proper academic peer-reviewed project, which is looking at all of this in one go. And this was true of the project Seed Slip, which was led out of the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology in Lancaster in the north of the UK. And I mean, this was a wide-ranging project looking at all aspects of a kind of PFLA system. It wasn't restricted just to certified members. There were about 60 to 70 farms included in total, some of which weren't certified, but we were talking about a kind of set of, you know, a set of mindsets and practices which were common within the membership, not just certified. And I thought I'd pick out two things from the results that we've seen. The one on the left is a bit of analysis that comes out of something called the Public Goods Tool, which in the UK is a developing way of assessing on-farm sustainability, you know, around a number of metrics. So you can see all the different words around the outside of that circular diagram represent a different aspect of a farm which is being measured. And obviously red is not so good, green is very, very good. So I suppose, you know, a farm that was ticking every single box would score 5 on each metric. The blue line connecting all those dots was what where the PFLA on average came out. And I think you would probably all agree that that's a pretty impressive result for a group of 60 to 70 farms, which covered a number of different farming types, a number of different geographies. And the only ones that didn't score quite so well were the agricultural systems diversity, which I think relates primarily to the fact that a lot of the farms that would have taken part were just doing one enterprise. And then the water management, which I haven't quite got my head around, because I think in general the farmers that we work with are doing things like mob grazing, so generally getting better infiltration. So I'm not entirely sure what's kind of behind that not quite so good score, but it's a pretty impressive result in terms of trying to demonstrate the overall sustainability of a pasture-for-life system. And then something perhaps at a slightly more detailed level on the right was this really interesting analysis of the relationship between profitability and diversity. So the blue line on this shows the expected relationship between profitability and biodiversity. And the green line is what was actually found looking at this Pasture for Life cohort. So it was actually showing that there are, the two things aren't necessarily negatively correlated, and that there was a bit of a sweet spot in the sense of a farm that was trying to be profitable, but not pushing it too far, primarily down a yield route. And actually in doing so, you could end up with a kind of quite high level of profitability and biodiversity on the same farm. And this was something that took the researchers by surprise, I think. And it's definitely an area which we would like to to kind of look into further on the back of the biodiversity case studies that I showed earlier. I've briefly touched on earlier this whole idea of peer-to-peer learning being really at the heart of what we do at the PFLA, and it continues to be today. I mentioned the regional groups as a key mechanism for us to get people together, and this is really, you know, happening more and more now. Since COVID, we've started moving a lot of that. I mean, obviously we had to move a lot of that learning online, and actually at the end of COVID, we've ended up with just as well, actually lots more in-person learning and lots more online learning. So we've really been able to kind of up our capability in this area. So at the moment we're doing almost about a one sort of webinar a week for our members, and sometimes a wider group, on different aspects of farm management. It could be butchery, it could be grazing management. We did one on Monday night on the difficulty of feeding forage to pregnant ewes. So this is a big aspect of how we deliver value to our members for their £100. And then the other thing to say on this kind of learning and development is we're trying, I mean, I suppose this is definitely something I've recognized over the kind of 10, 12 years now that I've worked in the kind of food system, is that the really innovative things tend to be very personal. They're people who are developing things because that's the way they're wired. And how you then get that learning out to a wider group of people tends to be quite ad hoc, sporadic in nature, because the people who go and search those pioneers out tend to be relatively pioneering themselves. You know, they're the people who aren't kind of taking no for an answer and going and finding people, going and meeting them, visiting their farms and learning for themselves. So ultimately what you have is a group of quite like-minded people who are all learning from each other, which is great. But when it comes to trying to expand this learning to the more conventional sector, it presents problems, because you've got clashes of personality, or you've got clashes of geography, where the person you really want to go and learn from is in a completely different part of the country. So we're working quite hard now on trying to develop more structured, formalized learning opportunities. And because we're very much a peer-to-peer approach, mentoring has been something that we've really picked up on. So that basically means training farmers who are doing it already to become mentors, paying them to do that, and then paying them to mentor people. And we've been successful recently in getting some money actually from the government via some of our kind of national park areas to help us do that in the southeast of the country. So this is something that we're really hoping to kind of to move on. When it comes to influencing, and I mentioned labeling earlier, because of our size, and we are still ultimately a very small organization, we have really relied over the first 10 years of our life on a group of very core volunteers, which would include the founders and some early directors. We've also relied on other members to make certain introductions and to advocate for us. And then also we're members of a number of alliances in the UK, which kind of allow us to kind of, I guess, have greater impact than we would otherwise have. So that's been very much where we've been in the first half. As we build our capacity as an organization, we've started doing some things on our own. And actually a really good example of that is a labeling consortium that we've started to try and lobby the government to change, well, to kind of to improve the labeling regime in the UK, which would definitely benefit us as a kind of higher value, higher quality option. At the moment, labeling in the UK is very inconsistent. I think it's fair to say confusing if you're a member of the public. It doesn't capture all of the food sold. For example, any food that's sold in a catering environment, whether that's hospitality or kind of corporate catering, none of that has to be labeled. And actually pre-pandemic, that was about 50% of all food sold in the UK. So there's huge gaps. And one of the key things this consortium is trying to do is to get, first of all, a mandatory labeling scheme so that everyone has to do it everywhere and there's no kind of get outs. And also going back to that carbon question, we want the data to be used to be primary data, as in coming from the farm and making its way through the supply chain. And we feel that's the only way really that we're going to get value for the right sorts of systems. And then we also think, as all of these things are evolving, that any labeling regime needs to be fluid and flexible as the situation changes. So at the moment, we're trying to build the consortium, we're trying to influence government, and we're trying to kind of build the evidence also on why labeling works, and there are some really good examples of that. So this is a good example of the PFLA kind of reaching a level of maturity, perhaps, to allow us to start getting more directly involved in some of the bigger issues of the day. And then kind of finally, as if you kind of think back to that circular model, we're kind of coming back round to the beginning again. So all of this work that I've just kind of outlined, the evidence building, the influencing, the learning and development, this all just gives us a wonderful platform to go out and reach out to people and make new friends, get businesses to buy into what we're doing. And there are, this has probably been the hardest bit, I think it's fair to say, to get off the ground, how you convince a business to kind of buy into what you're doing. You've got to have all your arguments lined up. And I would say it's only really now, I think, that we're starting to have all of that in place so that we can have these conversations more confidently. A really good example, I've got their logo there, a business called Able & Cole, which is one of the leading kind of veg box distributors in the UK. They're picking, and they're all organic, and they're picking up Pasture for Life as a kind of premium within their organic range. And that's probably the best kind of market determinant at the moment of where we are as a brand and where we are as a kind of a saleable product. There are kind of smaller scale butchers who do really great things working with us. So the Ethical Butcher, and then the person who's the picture on the far left of your screens, he's just an individual butcher called Simon, who's got an amazingly big following, who loves what we do, and he kind of pushes us all the time. So it's these sorts of relationships that we're kind of looking to build, and obviously looking to get into increasingly high profile people as well to support what we're doing, to really take our message to the wider public. And that is really what the goal of all of this is, because we do think it's the public that are going to ultimately support the change to the farming system that we need. And in my eyes, if we think about the PFLA at inception, which was really quite strictly a farming movement, and I think remained as a farming movement for much of the last 10 years, we really need to turn what we're doing into much more of a food movement. So, we're not just talking about farm practice, we're talking about elements of what we're doing that relate to what people are eating, their health, the health of our landscapes, access to nature. All of these things need to be kind of packaged up in almost as one, really. And I think if we can do that successfully with our big kind of friends and supporters, that's going to stand us in the best stead for the next 10 years and really allow us to help accelerate this sort of farming. I mean, one kind of stat to leave you with really is that 70% of land in the UK is farmed, and of that land, about 70% is grazed. So that equates to roughly 50% of the entirety of the UK is grazed in some form or another. And that is a huge opportunity as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the impact that we can have. And again, that doesn't have to mean getting everyone to 100% pasture fed, but it does mean that we can have some sort of role in helping farmers who manage ruminant livestock to do things better, and whether that's better for the environment, better for the animals, or better for ourselves. That's, and any of those would do in some respects to show that the impact that Pasture for Life can have. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jimmy. That was really, really interesting. I was looking forward to the talk, and I wasn't disappointed. There's lots to think about on lots of different issues. I see we've got some questions from Anna in the chat, but can I ask you just some just for information first? So you never said how many certified farmers you have just now?
Yeah, so it's about 130 at the moment. So quite a small number in reality. I think I'd probably say there were, and I have no data to back this up, but I would surmise that there might be another 130 who are at the level, maybe not necessarily within the membership, but who are at the level but not certified. I mean, we definitely know of people, for example, who sell direct and just think that it's all comes down to their relationship with the customer who comes to their farm to pick up, and therefore they don't need certifications to verify what they're doing. That's completely fair enough. Many of those would be members because they like what they get for membership, but they just don't feel they need to be certified. I think in some respects that's a reality of certification, that it suits bigger, more elongated supply chains more than it does the sort of supply chains that we're looking to foster, which again, it shows why I think certification is a tool in the arsenal, not necessarily an end in itself.
Do you have any idea what percentage of the tonnage of certified meat is direct sold? I imagine it's quite a high proportion.
It's something that we're trying. So we've just got a couple of people working. We just hired a couple of people to work on supply chain specifically as part of our regional grouping approach, and it's data we want to get a better handle on. I think again, I would assume it's over 50%, comfortably. Yeah.
So Anna's asking, people can speak if they want, but anyway, we'll start with these. That she was interested in the different groups of people that are in your membership. Yeah,
so actually, Anna, at the moment, we have a flat £100 membership fee for everyone, whoever you are, wherever you're coming from. As we speak, we are working on a more structured, tiered approach to membership. So particularly for me, this would mean that student membership level, I think we're missing a big trick there. So actually I originally joined the PFLA as I suppose as an interested observer. I was encouraged by another PFLA member to part with my £100, but I always felt it was quite a lot of money for someone who, doesn't spend £100 on that many things. And in hindsight, it's been, I'm very glad to have parted with my £100, but I think there'll be lots of people out there who would prefer to pay a bit less. Gwyn's nodding his head. I press gang Gwyn into joining a couple of weeks ago. And so we're looking at a slightly lower rate for, I think, probably a member who doesn't have an obvious business interest.
Yeah. We've been, I'm asking because, as you know, I run a similar Swedish organization, so this has been hugely interesting for me to see. Lots of the things you've said were very interesting and food for thought, but because we have a much cheaper membership fee, and I've often wondered whether maybe we are too cheap. But what we try to do is get organizations, companies to pay a lot more. And I was wondering if you'd managed to crack that one, because.
So I think, as well as looking below the £100 on how we can make it easier for some people, and I think I would include in that really small scale farmers. For example, farmers who don't have as much as 5 hectares of land, they're excluded from every government, at least in England, every government subsidy available. So I think there's a good reason to make things a bit cheaper for them. If we're looking above £100, there's definitely good evidence that I've seen that even some farms are willing to pay more, for example, to get more of their team involved. And I think it's in some ways it's a sad fact that a lot of the people who are the member in our organization might be the landowner, but not the people who are actually doing the work. And I think we're missing a bit of a trick there to try and get those people, who might often move from farm to farm based on the job that they've got, get them involved. So that there are ways we're looking at that from a farming perspective. And that would also equate to whether that's food businesses or, I would love to get the big conservation organizations to support us financially and get their field officers onto our farm walks, into the conversation. One thing I don't want to do is end up with a situation where the big businesses are paying all the fees, and either it looks like we're in the pockets of big business, or there's a practical reality of having to kowtow to those businesses to keep them on side and to keep our revenue going. So I think that would be the worry for me if we went too far down that way.
Okay, before we go on to Anna's next one, I've got one for you. I was wondering about the issues you might face if you try to scale up. so you're currently in a high value, exclusive, we can say it that way, niche, aren't you? Do you think that it's possible to maintain the added value, the prices, the higher prices, if you scale up? That's the one side of it, on the price side. And then it strikes me also that you're a community of believers just now, and that if you scale up, at some point you're going to become a community that has a lot more rule followers in it. And just now you're saying, well, how you're trying not to be prescriptive now. So on both those sides of things, what challenges do you think there would be if you scale up?
Well, I think you've outlined most of them. I think it's a big challenge. I think we have to take these things as they come. When it comes to the general issue of scale and price, I suppose. I suppose the way I would look at that is, and this is somewhat playing out in the conversations we're having at the moment with wholesalers, for example. So we're really keen to get wholesalers on board, because there are lots of routes to market that are barred from you if you're not working with wholesalers. And I should just be very clear: we don't handle product. We're just there as a kind of facilitator in these conversations. It strikes me that if you want to deal with larger accounts, whether that's an intermediary or whether that's a final retailer, for example, you're going to need to be selling at a lower price than you would be if you were selling direct. And the more intermediaries you put into the equation, the harder it's going to be. And I think the ways around that at a basic level are just to have the different scales of farm working with different scales of customer. And I think there's a kind of natural order of things there. A bigger farm might not need to make quite as much profit per animal as a smaller farm. And so when it comes to the smaller farms, we do a lot of work on helping them sell direct, recognizing that is ultimately probably where they're going to make the most profit. We've looked at ways we can get smaller farms working with each other in a kind of cooperative fashion. I think the evidence in the UK seems to be that farmer cooperatives of a pure nature tend to be quite tricky, but I do think there are good examples of where an individual farm that might have deeper pockets takes a bit of risk, but then commits to work with other local farmers in a cooperative fashion without necessarily signing a piece of paper that says they're equal owners of something. So I think there are lots of really good things happening. And at the moment, I don't see scale as being a major problem, but we're not also not there yet. So if there was ever something happening with the supermarket, I think we'd probably lose members, because there are lots of people in the organisation who are doing what they're doing because supermarkets have ruined the system, if that's the way to describe it. So I think I in some ways I see things as being quite positive there. And actually, even for a bigger farmer, I would still be encouraging them to sell something direct, because the greater the diversity of your sales channels, that should lead to greater economic resilience for sure. When it comes to the standards, which was the other part of your question, I think what's key is that we have complete control of the standards. So as the organization grows, as the number of certified farmers grows, as the number of certified butchers and businesses grow, we have the ability to kind of take a decision because it's the right principled decision to take, not because we're concerned about the impact it's going to have on our income. And as long as we can maintain our independence in that way, I think we will be able to kind of stay ahead of those risks. Okay.
Helen is asking a question that relates to the standards in the wider chain. So how do you deal with abattoirs? It's often a problem that people have limited supply.
Yeah,
not necessarily the best standards always. How do you cope with that?
So abattoirs is a big issue, both the availability of them and also in some cases their standards. At the moment, and as I said, we don't do formal audits of supply chain entities. So with abattoirs, it's a bit more formal in that we would look to see what checks and balances they already have. So if they're organic audited, that would be an easy tick. If they're not organic, we would probably dig into the audits that they have had. So obviously all abattoirs have to be audited. If the abattoir has been audited by a government body and has had some non-compliances, then that would be a red flag for us, and we would probably encourage a farmer not to use them. That said, a lot of this, and I mean, I know there are some movements in the UK about how you develop certification methods without costly auditing, and these concepts of peer-to-peer auditing. I think at least for us at the moment, that a big element of what we've been able to achieve so far is the fact that we are a community, and lots of the farmers I speak to know their abattoir owners and managers very, very well, and there's a level of trust there that exists, not across the whole spectrum, but certainly in some cases. I think abattoirs are under immense pressure from a regulatory perspective, also from a cost perspective. So we do work at the kind of governmental level on how to improve the abattoir provision and support in the UK. So that's also a big focus. And actually there are examples of farmers in our network who are quite keen to build new abattoirs to try and solve their problems. So that's a kind of wide spectrum of options there.
Okay, Anna, do you want to come in again?
Right. Well, I was very interested in your regional groups, and how does that work? How do you finance them, and how do they work?
It's funny, Anna. I was slightly worried you'd heard all of this before, but maybe you haven't been in those meetings when I've been talking about it. So the regional project was a kind of discrete, as in bounded project that we bid for the money. It was $250,000 over 3 years to get these groups set up and put a facilitator in place, which is a person who's only working 1 day a week. And we've now got about 13. There are still some coming online. There have been lots of learnings along the way, but I mean, one of the positive ones, which is what we were hoping or expecting, was that once you have a group set up and you've got a good facilitator in place, there's a kind of virtuous cycle of that person connecting themselves to people in that region and potentially unlocking extra funding streams. So there have been some good examples where we've been able to access local funding, primarily project-based, which has allowed us to kind of do more locally, but also I see that potentially representing a good means of keeping these groups funded over the long term. We'd have to see quite impressive growth in membership numbers to pay for all of that centrally. So we're going to need a mix of probably central funding and external funding to keep that going. We're also playing with playing with how many groups we need and what's the right size of the region and all of that stuff. But there's some really good case studies of how the group has unlocked both other funding streams, but also other kind of completely new areas of work, which has been really good.
Yeah, interesting.
Go for it, Anna. You're on a roll.
Well, this is what I work with all day, every day. So it's wonderful to have somebody to discuss with. But we're also asked a lot now to be partners in various research projects, which is really good because, as you say, they've started to actually use us as well as a bouncing block, at least, not just can you give us access to your farmers, which used to be the question. But I want to come back to the access to your farmers, because we have a problem with getting the research projects to pay decently for the farmers. The scientists seems to be somehow deluded, thinking that farmers have nothing to do all day and are happy just to help progress. And I find that really upsetting. How do you deal with that?
So I would say almost in every case there's some payment, but it does vary wildly. Probably the lowest I've seen is £200 a day.
Okay, well, that's pretty. I would say that was pretty decent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the highest, which actually bizarrely has come from a government project we're currently doing, which is £550 a day.
Yeah, right. Yeah, But and do you sort of go in and say this early in the process?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I guess we just have to tough up a bit.
I think also maybe in Sweden there's this idea that people are always talking together, so it's something you do as part of being Swedish, maybe.
Yeah.
In the UK, people don't have that attitude so much. Maybe.
I love to go into meetings and things.
Anna, are you on Livestock?
No, that one we've missed. That I don't think that might not even be in Sweden.
Are you on Pathways then?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, I've got a general one, I suppose. Really, what do you think is the future? Where next? What's the thing you really want to do? Where's the thing that you really want to devote resources, whether you have the funding or not? What would you really like to do in the next couple of years?
Well, for me, I think the kind of evidence building is taking care of itself now. And for me, it's about education. How do we set up comprehensive education schemes to bring more farmers along this journey? And I think there's got, the key attributes of success will probably be giving quite high levels of visibility to the farmer that comes into it in terms of the pathway, where they're going to end up at the end. We'll be dealing with people that will want more certainty than there is at the moment. You've got to be happy with a fairly high level of ambiguity, I think, in the kind of current paradigm. And I think we need to move to a place where there's a more guaranteed market at the end. It's a kind of more kind of visible step-by-step process to get there. And so, I mean, I'm hoping in the next 6 months we'll have some clarity on funding that will help us at least have 2 people in the team who can focus on this. But that's still somewhat up in the air at the moment.
Okay. So last chance for anybody. If there's any questions, raise your hand. Don't have to put them in the chat. Well, just while we're waiting there, just to say that this video, Mr. Page, how are you?
Hi, Matt.
Just to prove I'm here. Yeah, thank you. That was just to prove I'm here. I just thought I'd mention a couple of things very briefly, which is when I started 3 years ago, probably, I was doing 1 animal or 2 animals a year direct sales. And now I'm up to, well, I've doubled that, but also I'm getting more and more calls from people who've come through the PFLA website who are asking for meat. So I'm getting a direct benefit in that way. It's not big. I guess I sell maybe 10% of my animals direct and the other 90% to abattoirs without any PFLA markup. But the number of direct sales coming through PFLA has gone up. And I wasn't sure whether Jimmy mentioned the Google group. There's a fantastic. Did you mention that, Jimmy?
Well, it was. Funny enough, it was on the learning and development page.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't pick it up specifically
because that's incredibly valuable. We've got this group of people who chuck out questions, and all sorts of really interesting and enterprising farmers chip in with clever ideas, how to manage flies on livestock, or very practical things like that in very wet periods, what to do next with your the very practical questions. And it's that Google group is really valuable. So I just say, from a producer's point of view, that it really has brought benefits from knowledge and from sales.
It's great to hear.
Yeah, good on you. Thanks, Nat. Okay. Well, there doesn't seem to be any further questions. So you can see more of the PFLA on pastureforlife.org. That's right, isn't it?
That's
One
right.
word, pastureforlife.org. Have you got YouTube channel?
We do, yes.
Okay.
That's actually a overflowing YouTube channel at the
Okay,
moment.
and
Fantastic.
you're also on Facebook and various other places, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so this the video of this meeting will be going up on our own channel, but we'll link to it on Facebook and you can link to it yourselves. So I'd just like to thank you very much, Jimmy. It was really interesting. We had to wait for it to happen because the organization is so busy, which is a good thing. As I say, I find it inspiring really as an organization. And I've also been interested in the Google chats that I get from my 100 pounds. So thank you very much, Jimmy. And thanks all for coming, and see you again.
Thanks,
Thank
Gwyn.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.